In December 1973, in Pottawatomie County, Oklahoma, a 71-year-old man stood leaning against the fence of his own pasture, watching a steel drilling rig rise in the middle of his grazing land. The low growl of diesel engines filled the whole flat. The wind carried the heavy, wet smell of freshly opened earth and drilling mud into the man's face. Otis Renfro had run cattle on this land for more than 50 years. He knew every foot of it, but he had not put that rig there. The men who had put it there were the ones who, 3 weeks earlier, had knocked on his door and said, "Mr. Renfro, the oil here belongs to our company now." And before they raised that rig, those men had checked everything: the county records, the chain of title, the lease signed back in 1959. They had checked all of it, except for one thing. And that one thing sat quietly in a drawer in Otis Renfro's bedroom, inside an old cigar box. That winter, half the country was lined up at gas stations, staring at "No gas today" signs. The price of a barrel of oil had quadrupled in a matter of months. And that same oil had suddenly turned this pasture, which no one had bothered with for years, into a gold mine. There are a few things you need to know about Otis Renfro, because nothing he did after this makes any sense without knowing where he came from. He had been born in 1903, on the very land where his cattle now grazed. His father had begun working this meadow before Otis ever came into the world. In his whole life, Otis had never owned anything but land, and you couldn't call it a fortune. 320 acres, a handful of cattle, an old pickup, and a pair of legs that no longer held up the way they once had. His wife had died 4 years earlier. Since then, he had run the farm mostly alone, calling on a neighbor boy down the road now and then for the heavy work. He was a 71-year-old man, alone, with little money, and against him stood a company swollen with oil boom money, come up from Oklahoma City, with its lawyers and its engineers. On paper, it didn't look like a fair fight at all. But Otis Renfro had one trait most folks in town didn't know about. In all his life, he had never thrown away a single piece of paper that came into his hands. His father had taught him this habit. When Otis was still a boy in the late 1920s, one of the biggest oil booms Oklahoma had ever seen broke out at Seminole. Overnight, the muddy roads filled with land brokers, with contract ledgers, with city men in suits. Everywhere there was the sharp smell of crude oil and the noise of drilling rigs. Otis's father had seen how neighbors who had farmed their whole lives were cheated by these men. One neighbor signed a contract he hadn't read and, over a few lines set in fine print, lost his farm entirely. That evening, his father sat Otis down at the kitchen table and told him this: "These men are counting on you not to read. Read every line, and keep every piece of paper that comes into your hands, because someday, if a company tries to take something from you, only that paper will save you." Otis never forgot those words. 40 years later, reading a contract, he could still hear his father's voice. In 1959, when Otis was 56, a small local oil company called Vinson Oil offered him an oil and gas lease. Otis spread the lease out on the kitchen table and read every line, the way his father had taught him. The terms were ordinary for the time. A 10-year primary term, a 1/8 royalty on the oil produced, and, in the middle of the lease, a single, easily overlooked sentence. That sentence said the lease would hold for 10 years, and thereafter only so long as oil or gas is produced from the land. Otis ran his finger under that line, then signed his name. A year later, in 1960, Vinson Oil drilled a well on his pasture, recorded as Renfro No. 1. Thanks to this well, which produced only a few barrels a day, a small royalty check, even the largest of them under $30, came to Otis's mailbox every month. And Otis filed every check stub, in order of date, in an old King Edward cigar box his father had left him. As the years passed, the well wore out. A few barrels a day fell in time to a single barrel a day, and back then, a barrel of oil was worth only about $3. At a certain point, running the well cost Vincent oil more than the well brought in. So in the summer of 1967, Vincent Oil came, plugged Renfro number 1, pulled out the pump, drew up the pipe, and left. That summer, the last royalty check arrived in Otis's mailbox. He laid its stub on top of the others and closed the box. Sitting in the kitchen that evening, what his father had said years before came back to him, that a lease lives only as long as the oil flows. The oil was no longer flowing. Otis may not have thought long and hard that day about exactly what it meant, but one thing he knew by instinct: the date on that last stub in the box would one day matter. For the next 6 years, grass grew over the site of the well, the iron pieces rusted, and everyone forgot about it. But in the county records of Pottawatomie County, that 1959 lease still sat there because no one had ever formally recorded its release. On paper, a dead thing still looked alive. In ordinary times, this made no difference. That old lease slept for years on a dusty shelf. But in the middle of an oil boom, a piece of paper that looks alive even though it is dead is the most dangerous thing there can be. Because sooner or later someone would come and look at it and would believe what they saw. At the end of 1973, that someone came. In October, after the war in the Middle East, the Arab countries had placed an oil embargo on America. Oil that had been $3 a barrel had climbed past $11 within months and was still rising. Suddenly, every old well that hadn't turned a profit in the 1960s, every forgotten field, became a promise of fortune again. Brant Petroleum, an ambitious and well-capitalized company based in Oklahoma City, began combing through the old fields in the area. Its men went to the Pottawatomie County Courthouse, searched the records by hand, and found the 1959 Renfro lease never released. These people were not fools. They did the title work, they read the records, they knew their business. They got just one thing wrong. They assumed that the lease sitting in the records was still valid. They saw that the paper was there, but they did not check that the well had died years before, that production had stopped. They reasoned from the paper they saw. At the end of November, Brant Petroleum's man came to Otis's door. His name was Kurt Mercer. He was in his 40s, neatly dressed, an utterly self-assured man. With him was another, older, quiet company man, Walt Doss. Mercer told Otis that the company held the lease, that they would drill on his pasture, and that the oil belonged to the company. Otis, for his part, went inside, brought the old cigar box from the drawer in his bedroom, and laid the royalty stubs out on the table. Mercer glanced at the box and smiled. "No offense, Mr. Renfro," he said, "but a handful of old payment stubs isn't a lease. This paper earned your family $8 a month. We're going to turn it into something far more valuable, and on your own land at that. Be glad of it." Then he paused a moment and added, "A man in your position doesn't know what held by production means." Otis said nothing, but the older man beside him, Walt Doss, picked up one of the stubs from the table and looked at it a little longer than he needed to. Then, without a word, he set it back down. Mercer didn't notice. And if he had, he wouldn't have cared. After the men left, Otis closed the box, put it back in the drawer, and waited. There was nothing in that box to impress Kurt Mercer. But arranged in the right order against the right clause, those stubs were about to do something that none of Brant Petroleum's money could undo. While Mercer's men were putting up the rig, Otis Renfro did not panic. One morning he got into his old pickup, took the cigar box with him, and drove to Shawnee, to the office of a lawyer in the county seat. The lawyer's name was Asa Tillman. He was old, tired, a man who had handled small-town cases for 40 years. When Otis explained the situation, Tillman at first shook his head. "Mr. Renfro," he said, "these oil companies have whole rooms full of lawyers, going up against them with an old lease and a box full of receipts." He didn't finish the sentence, because just then Otis had spread the lease out on the table and was pointing his finger at that single line he had underlined years before. Tillman put on his glasses and read that line. In the dusty air of the office, no sound was left but the ticking of the clock on the wall. At last, Tillman lifted his head and asked, "How did you know this?" Otis only said, "My father taught me. This was the very heart of the story. And to understand it, you needed to understand only one sentence." The 1959 lease said the lease would hold for 10 years, and thereafter only so long as oil or gas is produced from the land. This is a very old and very clear rule in the law. A lease like this lives as long as the oil flows, and the moment the oil stops, it begins to die. The 1960 well had produced oil, true. That oil had held the lease up for years, but that well had been plugged in 1967, its pump removed, its pipe pulled. And when the 10 years the lease allowed ran out in 1969, not a single drop of oil was flowing from the land. Because none was flowing, the lease, by its own words, had ended on its own that day, back when Brant Petroleum was nowhere in sight, a full 4 years earlier. So when Brant drilled that well in 1973, it was in fact drilling on land for which it held no valid lease at all. No one at Brant had noticed this because they had all looked at the paper in the records and assumed it was still alive. They had reasoned from the paper. Otis, on the other hand, truly knew the fact that the well had fallen silent years before. Over the following weeks, Tillman put the evidence together piece by piece. First, he went to the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. There in the records lay the document showing that Renfro No. 1 had been officially plugged in 1967, its pipe pulled and its equipment removed. There was also the royalty stub in the cigar box dated to the summer of 1967, which stated exactly when production had stopped, as precise as a calendar. The third was the 1959 lease itself, with that one sentence. But Tillman asked for one more thing. In the course of the case, he requested Brant Petroleum's own file. Inside the file that came back was a note written in Walt Doss's hand months before the drilling. The note said that the Renfro well had been plugged in 1967 and that the lease may have expired. Mercer had ignored this note, wanting to drill before the boom cooled. So the paper that would wound Brant the most was not someone else's. It was the paper written by Brant's own man. That quiet, older man who had come with Mercer, who had looked a few extra seconds at the stub Otis laid on the table. He had, it turned out, written down what he saw. The case was heard one morning in the county court in Shawnee. Brant's 2 young lawyers arrived early with their leather briefcases and their tidy suits. Otis sat quietly beside Tillman. When his turn came, Tillman stood and read that sentence from the 1959 lease aloud, then set 3 things on the table in order: the Commission's plugging document, the royalty stub, dated 1967, and Walt Doss's own note. Then he stepped back. No one in the room moved. A few months earlier, in Otis's kitchen, Kurt Mercer had said, "A man in your position doesn't know what held by production means." Now, the full weight of that sentence had come down on the company that had spoken it, because that old farmer knew what held by production meant better than anyone else in that room. The room was so quiet that even someone shifting his chair slightly was too much. But Brant's lead lawyer did not give up easily. He stood and, in a calm voice, argued that the well's stoppage had only been temporary. Wells stop for repairs, for maintenance, he said, and then run again. A few quiet years do not kill a lease. For a moment this sounded reasonable. A few heads in the room nodded slightly, and the weight in the air seemed to shift. Then Tillman stood up. A well that has been plugged, its pipe pulled, its equipment hauled away, and that hasn't run even once in 6 years, hasn't paused. It's dead. Moreover, he added, by law it is the company operating the well that must prove the stoppage was temporary, not the farmer, and Brandt could not prove it. After all, its own men had already written in their own notes that the lease might have expired. The judge examined the documents one by one. The 1959 lease, the plugging record, the stub, the note. Then he gave his ruling. The lease had ended years earlier by its own terms. Brandt Petroleum held no valid right over that land, and the oil there belonged to Otis Renfro. When Otis heard the ruling, he did not leap up, did not even smile. He only nodded once, slowly, just the way his father used to nod when something had finally fallen into place. The court ruled that, because it considered Brandt not a bad faith party but a company that had relied in good faith on the paper in the records, Brandt had to pay Otis the value of the oil it had produced, though it could deduct its reasonable drilling and operating costs from that. As for what came afterward, the matter was much simpler. The oil was Otis's. When the accounting closed months later, Otis Renfro was paid roughly $165,000 for the oil Brandt had pulled up to that day. For a 71-year-old small-time cattle farmer, it was the largest sum of money he had ever seen at once. The well, producing about 90 barrels a day, was now his. He leased it out again on his own terms, took a 1/4 royalty, and in the first months, the well paid him over $7,000 a month. That figure was more than he earned from his cattle in a whole year, every month. As the years went on and the well slowed, the second oil crisis of 1979 pushed prices up again, and the checks kept coming. Otis didn't move. He tended his cattle, mended his fence, put most of the money in the bank, and set some aside for his grandchildren. The well that had been overgrown with grass for years was running again. But this time, for the true owner of the land. The man who had looked down on him, Kurt Mercer, left Brandt before the year was out. And that quiet older man, Walt Doss, drove out to the farm one afternoon. Not to talk business. By the fence he shook Otis's hand, said, "Your father taught you right," and then got in his truck and drove away. Looking back, this whole story rested on 3 simple things. A lease that anyone could read, but only one man truly understood. A cigar box full of small slips of paper that a company laughed at. And a single sentence written in 1959 that outlived all the men who signed it. Years before, at a muddy kitchen table, Otis's father had told him, "Only paper will save you." And as that steel rig turned in the middle of the pasture, that paper did exactly that. Most of us have something like it somewhere. A piece of paper forgotten in a drawer, a receipt or a habit left to us by someone long gone, something that seems unimportant but could one day change everything. Maybe it has happened to you too. Someone wrote you off without even bothering to learn the truth, and you quietly waited on what you knew to be right. If you've had a moment like that, you can share it in the comments. And if these are the kinds of stories that sit well with you, where the quiet ones, patience, and the right piece of paper, kept safe, win out in the end, then subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is for.